Thank you for coming this evening. And I want to thank Beth Timmerman for the opportunity to do this as she does usually. About late fall, she'll call me and say, oh, would you like to make a presentation? You know, you want to speak at the Kalamazoo Public Library? And that's a silly question, as she knows, because I always love coming to the library and talking. And I've had the pleasure of doing this on some, well, I don't know how many Februarys I've done this. Although I have to say the weather is much better than what it was a couple years ago when we had a very huge snowstorm which kept a lot of people away. So that was very, very nice, and I appreciate that. When I was thinking about what I wanted to present to you this evening, there were several different things, but I always go back to this, and that is Kalamazoo's Colored School. I don't know when it was that I first learned about it or first read about this school. I don't know if it was when I first read Willis Dunbar's Kalamazoo Place Behind the Product. No, excuse me, not Place Behind the Product. I knew I was going to say that. Kalamazoo and How It Grew and Grew. I don't know if it was when I read the 1880 county history and found information about it. All I can say is when I read it many years ago, there was something about it that just grabbed me. It was hard for me to put my hands around the fact of, for a 10-year time period, in 1861 to 1871, that we had a segregated school in Kalamazoo. It was hard because I was thinking about what else was going on. Kalamazoo County, you know, we had a lot of people that were involved with the anti-slavery movement. We had the Underground Railroad down in Schoolcraft, which made it even harder for me to try to figure out how this happened, why this happened. I want to tell you that this evening is a little different in a presentation because it's not one that has conclusions, because we're still working on this. We're still collecting information. We are not done. But what Regina and I wanted to do this evening is to bring to you what we have found so far, because it's a lot more than what has been found previously about this. So what you'll see at the end of it are questions that we still have out there that we would like to answer. So our work on this subject hasn't ended just because we're presenting you this information this evening. The other thing that I want to say is that if I had attempted to do this program 30 years ago, 35 years ago, now you know how long I've been doing this stuff, even maybe longer, it would have been totally different, because the material that is available now and in the format that it is available now is so totally different from the way that it was there when I first got started with this. And for that, I'm very, very happy. There are so many things now that you can access on databases and through Ancestry and other sources that are out there that, you know, came to the archives at Western. And this really, truly has been and continues to be a collaborative program between material that the library has, material that the museum has, and material that we have at Western in pulling this all together. So it really, I think, I'm certain, because for years, when I would find information, I'd put it in a folder and just have it there. And I'm glad I waited, because I think it made a very big difference in the presentation.
So I was very lucky to come along after she had put these things in the folder. So the folder was already there, and I made the mistake of saying, hey Lynn, do you want help on that? And now I'm standing in front of you guys tonight, so you can see where that went. But kind of little of me, since I know Lynn has a big fan club, and some of you guys I know. But I came to Kalamazoo about 3 years ago, so I had a pretty big learning curve when it came to local history, and a lot of my way to get around that was talking to a lot of the people in this room who know a lot about local history already, and it was also just doing research. So in my first year, the blissful first year, I would putz around and do research on whatever was fun. Now I can't do that anymore because I don't have time, and then Lynn had this lovely project pop up, and I love a good research challenge. So that's kind of how I got started with Lynn on this. And we also want to take note, we know that we're calling it the Colored School. That is what it was called. So that word, we understand now, of course, is outdated and hurtful to many people. We are going to use it because that is the historical context, and that was the word we used to find this school throughout the historical record. So we just wanted to say that, and then we'll get into it. So this is one of the wonderful things that we have at the Kalamazoo Valley Museum. It is a bird's eye lithograph view of Kalamazoo, 1886-ish.
1860-ish.
Or 60th, sorry.
60s.
1860-ish. You can tell my nerves are showing because I'm getting dates wrong. This was made by Charles Schober Lithograph Company out of Chicago. It was printed locally by JCS Fitzpatrick out of the Gazette office. And it's kind of, Lynn brought it up to me that we have this in the collection, so I took a look at it and now am probably as in love with it as she is. It is not, which we'll talk a little bit about later, it's not an exact view of Kalamazoo during this time. Lithographs were generally made to show off the best of cities. So it's going to be the most recent buildings that were put up, the most beautiful churches, and the things that they really wanted to show off about the industrial, transportation kind of advancements of a city.
The thing about the view of this bird's eye view map, which made it so appropriate in approaching this subject tonight, is because of the direction. There are two other bird's eye view maps that were done in 1874 and 1883. Those were done looking from the west to the east. And this one, which when I was at the museum in another lifetime, was dated in the mid-1860s, and it's from the east looking to the west. So you can see the oxbow of the Kalamazoo River. Down here, this building right here is what they thought the Michigan Female Seminary was going to look like. And the Michigan Female Seminary was located on the corner of Gull and Riverview. And so it's a different view from what was done previous to that. And it's a good start in our just sort of setting the stage of what was Kalamazoo like in the 1860s. We have two photographs here. Now, they're not from the 1860s, but Regina, they're from your collection, so I'm going to let you explain those.
They are. Well, that's okay.
Yeah.
They are both of East Main Street. That's how they're labeled. Both of them, you can see the plank sidewalks. You can see up top and below a little bit some of the horse and carriages that you have going up and down the street. On the top one, if you look at the corner, it's Manis Israel's dry goods store. Henderson is down the street. On the bottom one, you can see D. Lilienfeld and Brother. He was part of the big cigar industry that was in Kalamazoo, and Frank Henderson is right next door. And to the left of D. Lilienfeld is the ticket office for the Michigan Central Railroad Company. So just views of what Kalamazoo
Just to
looks
sort of get us in the mood. Let's look at some statistics.
Yeah.
So population of the county, you can see up there, and you can see also the population of the village of Kalamazoo. We have been a village since 1843. You can see that when you look at the population of African Americans, that as far as, when you look at this, the village of Kalamazoo is about 25% of the population of the county. The African American population, about 68% of them, according to these statistics, lived within the village of Kalamazoo. One of the things that sort of frustrated us was trying to find statistics. Some of these statistics come from a book that was done in 1945 called Negroes in Kalamazoo. So they did have census information. As far as I'm not quite sure where Willis Dunbar got these statistics for African Americans in 1860, because one of the problems with Kalamazoo and how it grew is there are no footnotes and no sources, which has fluxed a lot of us in history, but that's what we have. Also threw in, the other thing that's interesting when you look at the county itself is that about half of the land was involved with agriculture. We had about 1,900 farms in the county at the time. You can see as far as the village goes, what we have. I thought it was interesting that we had actually one bowling alley, 23 saloons and restaurants. The hospital, of course, is the Michigan Asylum for the Insane, where years before either Bronson or Borges comes. And as far as manufacturing, basically we have two things. Agricultural implements, which makes sense when you think of all the people that were involved. In fact, at this time, about 90% of the people in Michigan were involved with agriculture. And also melodeons, which fortunately the Kalamazoo Valley Museum has some in their collection.
What is that?
It's a keyboard instrument, like a piano. Of course, national events had come upon Kalamazoo at this time. We have the firing on Fort Sumter and Lincoln's call. He actually called for a total of 75,000 troops for 3 months, because it was going to be a 3-month war. That's what he thought, a 90-day war initially. Now, the picture in the lower right-hand corner is Fireman's Hall, which was located on Burdick Street, the mall, where Klein Kalamazoo is located, and that was the public hall of the village. They had a meeting to discuss how they were going to be dealing with enlisting soldiers and forming companies. And the building on the left is where the Old Peninsula Brew Pub is located on the corner of East Michigan and Portage Street, and that's the first enlisting station where young men would go and enlist. So that certainly was a major theme on this, and I think you saw that in the newspapers, Regina, did you not?
Yeah, there were mentioned when we get a little bit further along of them talking very much about the effect that the war was having on students and it coming up consistently day to day, and they're kind of just coming into the classroom talking about the war and fighting.
Okay, so before we get into education in Kalamazoo and get to that at hand, let's sort of set the frame as far as what was going on with education. And I'm going to be as brief as possible. I'm going to be doing a series on Michigan history coming up here, and I'll be going into a little better detail, but I promise you I'll be going very, very briefly on this. A lot of these things sort of set the framework for what was happening in education in Michigan and later on in Kalamazoo. The Land Ordinance of 1785, which was passed by the Confederation Congress not long after the, well, in fact, 2 years before the end of the Treaty of Paris in 1787. And what that did is that established how the land in the Old Northwest, which is Michigan, Wisconsin, Indiana, Illinois, and Ohio, would be divided and surveyed and sold. But the one part of it that was interesting is that as the townships would be divided into squares of land, Section 16, that money would go towards funding education, which was the first time that there was any funding of education like that by a government or federal government. When Michigan became a territory in 1805, there were several things that happened there. Keep in mind that at this time period, it was the townships that were controlling the schools when they initially started during that 32-year period. And the territorial council would pass laws covering when you had to hire a teacher, how long school would last, and how to fund things, and also creation of private academies. When we had our first Constitution in 1835 and the first plan, it sort of laid some of the things that are still important in education today. The superintendent of instruction, which was the person who was going to be in charge of setting what was going on across the state, how long the primary school was going to be going, how libraries were going to be created, and that village could form a school district, and within that school district, hire various individuals who would operate it. And also the interesting thing is that money from Section 16 that I told you about from the Land Ordinance of 1785, that was now going to go into a primary school fund, and it was going to be divided up according to how many students were in your district, which sounds very familiar because that is still what goes on today. As far as once Michigan became a state, some of the things that happened in those early years, one of the things that they did in 1843 is allow school districts to create union school districts. And you'll notice how that relates to Kalamazoo, and also classify these according to grades. They also laid down the right to tax for schools, also how to tax for high schools, and also when to turn, well, the Board of Education, the idea of a Board of Education started right around 1859, right before the Civil War. The first district in Kalamazoo, District Number 1, opened their first school in 1833. And when you look at this picture on East South Street, the school itself was located actually right where the entrance is to that parking ramp. It was only there for about a year, and then the more permanent school was built next door to it. In fact, it was around that area. The thing about the first school is not only was it a schoolhouse, but it also became the first courthouse, and also was the first location for a lot of our religious denominations, and also a place where people would gather and debate the issues of the day. Now, one of the things that when you became a state, that you had, well, when Michigan became a state, and they passed these early laws, you had to hire somebody called the school inspector that would go around and take statistics every year. And what's really thrilling is a number of years ago, I got a call from Kay Risa. We have boxes and boxes that we want you to go take to the archives, which I did. And it was absolutely thrilling because there were school inspector reports that went back to 1837. And even tied up in little ribbons, cotton ribbons. I had to save the ribbons, I couldn't give them away. And so in 1837, just to give you a snapshot, we can see that District Number 1, which is Kalamazoo, they always referred to them as scholars. Had 63 scholars, had a teacher that was qualified for 3 months, and it talked about the amount of money that they would raise for various things. Now, it doesn't break that number down as far as boys, as far as girls. It doesn't cut it down as far as race or anything, but it does give it some early statistics there. Now, one of the things in Kalamazoo that happened during this time period is every time they opened a school, they created a new school district. So by the mid-1840s, by the late 1840s, we had 4 schools and we had 4 separate school districts. And one of the things that they had their own teachers and officers, and they had conducted all their affairs, and there was a feeling that maybe it was going to be a little unequal, and so they wanted to merge those together. And so there began to be a movement for a union school. It took them 10 years to reach it in 1857. And about 2 years later, in 1859, the Board of Education began in Kalamazoo. So it went from being the village of trustees being in charge of the school to the Board of Education. And our first union school was this building, built on the site of where the old Central is now, on the corner of Vine and Westnedge. It opened officially, opened in December of 1858, and it had 4 departments. It was divided into 4 departments. It was primary, intermediate, grammar, and high school. And that's the one thing I'm still trying to figure out what grades sort of fill with that. High school is no surprise, but trying to figure out where some of these grades were. Now, with the coming in 1859 of the school board, we begin to now see a series of catalogs that are being published every year by the Board of Education that gives wonderful statistics. This was the first one in 1859 to 1860. So you can see that the majority of students were going to the union school, but then they had these things called ward schools located in various areas. It also listed a lot of other statistics, also talked about coursework and also rules and regulations, and they came out with those for a number of years. And well, if you see this stamp down in the corner, you can see Kalamazoo Public Library. These catalogs, in fact, there's a set of the catalogs on the shelf that you can just go there in the local history room and pull off the shelf and look at them, and you'll be looking at these original catalogs. So that gives you a snapshot of where we are during this year. Okay, so ward schools. There were 3, but they divided north in half, and you can see that by the number, 222. This would have been in 1859 to 1860. I want to say neighborhood schools, but I still don't know in some cases why students would have gone to the union school rather than why they would have gone to a ward school rather than the union school. I don't know if they were like neighborhood schools initially. I'm not really too sure. That's another thing I'm sort of trying to find out myself. This was a mystery that I had wondered about a long time, and I sort of solved that mystery recently, and I had to send an email to Regina and say, I found it, I found it, I found it. That's this building right here. This is the old branch. One of the things that Michigan did early on is they wanted to open up a university in Ann Arbor, but they wanted to prepare students to go to the University of Michigan. And so they opened up branches across the lower part of the lower peninsula. And different villages and cities bid for a branch, and Kalamazoo got one. There were 9 branches that were opened up. And so this branch building was built. Now not only were they preparing young men to go to the University of Michigan, they were also agriculture. They were going to be teaching agriculture. They were going to have a female department there for women, so they would know, so they would have some sort of education. So there were multiple reasons for this branch building. And it was built on the east side of what is Bronson Park, because you've got Academy Street right there, because Titus Bronson had given that land for the first academy that was going to be built. Later on, when the branch merged with what was the Kalamazoo Literary Institute, they continued to use this building until 1857. And it's a wonderful story, which I will not go into, although I don't think it was wonderful at that time, when some individuals in Kalamazoo wanted that building moved out from the park, and one night they literally picked it up and moved it to the middle of Rose Street. And that was a whole nother story in itself. But then after that, it was sort of lost. We didn't know what happened. And if you read some of the histories, what was said is that it was moved over to the intersection of Willard and West Street. Well, what I find out is that it was used as the North School. And this is an 1873 map. And right here, it says B and P. That's where the old branch was moved. And the reason why I know that is because when you read the histories, the building was given to the firm of Bush and Patterson around the 1870s because they had just finished building Frank Street School, which we will touch on later on. So this was really nice because it solved a mystery for me as far as what happened to the branch building. Oh, I did not want to do that. So the ward schools. So when you look at the numbers, one of the things we do know about the ward schools is that they typically would have one teacher. From the descriptions, yes, like a one-room schoolhouse. So if you can imagine that one statistic I showed you, 222, that's the numbers of students that were registered. We don't know if that's the number of students who attended on a regular basis. Additionally, they, over the years, took over two schools that had been located in the township, Portage, which was sort of at the intersection of Lake and Portage Street, and eventually by 1877, they moved to their current location at Lake and Russell, and Alcott, which was over on the south side around South Burdick and Alcott Street. We do know, from what we've been able to find out, is that these ward schools were integrated. The reason why we know that is because in 1859, 1860, they do have a list of every student in the Kalamazoo schools at that time. And there are some names that we have found in not only the North Division schools, but the South and the East that later appear on some of the information we have about the colored school. So we know at that point that these schools were integrated. Okay.
So, like Lynn was saying, up to this point, as far as we know, all of the schools are integrated. And then I started hunting around in the Kalamazoo Gazette and found this. It shows up in an annual school meeting report that they printed all the text up in the newspaper, and they discuss all the motions for fixing fences and buying firewood for the schools. And then there was this line that they moved for $250 to be raised for the purpose of opening a colored school. And it was adopted. So this is the first time that we found anything that mentions the colored school directly, talking about the actual districts, talking through this being a process that they're going through.
The Kalamazoo Public Library has these two volumes in their possession. These are in their collection. These are Kalamazoo Public Schools, the Board of Education minutes, which has got a wealth of information. The challenge is that the first volume is missing. The two volumes that you see right there, the one on the left is one that I had a lot of, not a lot, but some information on the school. That goes from 1864 till about 1882. But the school board started in 1859, so that first volume had to be somewhere. But I think if I'm not mistaken, Catherine Larson and Beth Timmerman, that these two came in. Oh, I don't know where I've lost or whatever. No, I think it's there. I think these two volumes just came in. These two volumes. I mean, there was no other volume that you know of, Catherine, that came in.
No, I inherited when I came in 1981.
Okay, so they were here before 1981. But now Sharon Ferraro, who's sitting here in the front, had said that at one time she had been over at the administration building of the Kalamazoo Public Schools and had seen an older ledger there.
Sitting on a shelf.
Sitting on a shelf in the boardroom.
Just sitting there.
I don't know. That's a mystery. I don't know who to call, or I don't know if they would appreciate me going around and looking in the nooks and crannies of the administration building to see if I could find something. So when you're trying to find information on, do they say anything in the minutes about this whole thing, we're sort of lost because of what is missing, and that first volume is missing.
Yeah. So there's not a mention of it for a year, almost a year to the day. So this is September 6th, 1861, and the quote was too long to put on the screen. It would have been too much to read. But basically it's another annual report, and it discusses the colored school schoolhouse, teachers, and the students. So they start by talking about moving to raise $50 for a brick schoolhouse. Then they change their mind and say the Board of Education can get rid of whatever property they currently have, or move a building, or fix up a building to make this school for the students. The version of the article that we have is a little bit tricky to read. As all of you in this room will probably know, when you scan something on a binding, it leaves lovely shadows that cover up words. So that is another hunt to figure out exactly which spots they were looking at. But the ones they mention are a schoolhouse in the Welch edition, which I was just looking today, which my colleague Sarah will know. The Welch edition was level cedar and walnut near where the Union School ended up being. So they had a building there that they were going to do. And one on the northeast part of the village, and a brick house somewhere. So they said up to $100 they could move buildings, move lots, build a building, or fix up an existing one, but the budget was set at $100. So teacher also was mentioned. By the end of the article, they actually went up $50. They started out saying they would raise $250 for a teacher's salary, and at the very last they said $300. So somehow they got a raise with no knowledge. And really interestingly, at the very end, they talk about the students. And this is again when Lynn was saying that we know that the schools were integrated up to this point. At the very end of the article, there was an amendment that said that they wanted the black children to be immediately excluded from schools occupied by white children. It was followed up by a motion to strike that down and to remove the word immediately from the phrasing, because the concern was that there was no school building ready, and that motion was lost. And then they also moved to have the students be able to stay in school until their building was prepared for them. That amendment was also lost. And then the motion is done, and all the notes are done. So we don't really know the reasoning. I'm intrigued by the two people, Mr. Haydenberg and Mr. Cameron, who spoke up and tried to move that amendment, but they were met with resistance. So those were both lost amendments.
The first numbers that we have is in the catalog from 1861 to 1862, and that's where we have the number of 60. There is no teacher listed that year, so we don't know about that. As you can see with Regina, with the absence of the school board minutes, we do have what appeared in the Kalamazoo Gazette, because the Kalamazoo Gazette would go into great detail from the board meetings. So I guess in the end, that is at least better than having nothing. So we know at least that first year there were 60 names, or 60 students there.
So this was a map that I had a lot of fun with. I am notoriously not great with maps, so Lynn made me work on that.
Yes.
Through
And
this
I
project.
should mention, this is the 1873 Kalamazoo County Atlas.
Yes. So when Lynn was first showing me this, she had me hunt down the lithograph, and then we also hunted this down. So where they ended up putting the school was on the corner of North and Walbridge. You can see it, oh, you've got it. You can see it in the larger part up here, and then it's zoomed in down here. So this is where we know the school was, and this was 1873, and we'll talk a little bit about it at the end, but the district still owned this property. So now back to the lithograph that I mentioned. You'll probably get sick of looking at it by the end, because we really like looking at it.
It's not my screensaver. I look at it all the time.
So like we were saying before, this was a really popular way to kind of show off your city. From the 1850s to the early 1900s in the US, they would use this form. Lithography was cheaper and quicker than engraving, so they were able to kind of pump these out a little bit better, and people went nuts for them because they were these beautiful, large pieces that they could show off their city with. What we did find, of course, is that they are a little exaggerated. A colleague that a lot of you will know, Paula Messner, wrote in the record for this that, well, there's churches facing the wrong way, and the railroads aren't quite right, and there's a courthouse has a steeple. It didn't. So there's a lot of artistic license taken with this image, but what it also has given us is a view of what we think is the colored school building. So you can see in the upper left-hand corner, that's the bottom right-hand corner of the larger image that you were looking at. And the red building down there with the two small buildings at back that look like
Houses,
yeah, and 3 buildings on the side. It looks like a schoolhouse would look. It's on the corner of what we think is North and Walbridge in this bird's eye.
And you will not believe how long Regina worked on this to try to find
I
it.
believe that.
And it became close. Now, how this all meshed in was another piece that we had, and that came from the Delphian. And in 1909, there were 2 issues of the Delphian that came out to commemorate the 50th anniversary of the high school in Kalamazoo. The first one, 1859 to 1909, like this one. The first one had basically a list of all the school board members, all the teachers that were in the high school, all the students who graduated, so it was more statistical kind of information. The second one was reminiscences, and it was really interesting because it was filled with all kinds of reminiscences, memories from a lot of people who were involved with the school. But there was one that I found, nearly screamed when I saw it, because it dealt with the colored school. And cut it off, and this was another thing, cut it, or I should say copied it, and then put it in my folder. And so that's where this all came from.
So this is specifically talking about the way that the schoolhouse looked and was set up. So, you know, the way she describes it is pretty much what you'd think of a one-room schoolhouse. Door at one end, teacher's desk on the opposite side, 3 windows on each side, and all of them were painted dark red, like the ward schools. So again, more and more thinking that this is probably the school that we're talking about. So speaking of Eliza, she did teach at the colored school. There were 7 teachers that were there. Eastwater is Elizabeth. They were all female. We do know that some of them were there for a few weeks. Some of them were there for many months. Anna Janish is the longest standing one. She was taught at the school for 20 months and then has a much longer legacy, as I see many heads nod. She had a really, really interesting life and would be a totally different presentation of herself. So some were there for a few weeks, some were there for months at a time, the entire school year. When we look at these teachers, the Kalamazoo Public Schools did not have a training department until 1875. So these teachers would not have gone through that training program. We do know that at least 2 of them graduated from high school. One of them attended some college, of the ones that we've kind of been able to find some information on. And that was pretty normal for the time, that you would, go right into, if you were a woman, generally. You would go into teaching at a pretty young age after probably just finishing up high school, and then you would go into teaching. I found information on a few of them of where they were born. Anna Janish was born in Germany, so I found her interesting. My family's German. And Elmira Patch was born in Vermont, and Eliza Ensign in New York. So they are also reminiscent of that kind of Yankee movement into Michigan and immigration in general. The ones that I couldn't really track down as of yet, hoping we could find them, are the ones that had a little bit easier names, or more common names, like Baker and Bell. You would think I'd find something on Swaddle, but I didn't. I think I found her in Mount Pleasant, but I can't prove it because she got married, and I don't know who she married. Which brings up why we haven't probably found a ton of information on these women. They stopped teaching and got married, so then they disappear in the historical record. We know Eliza Ensign not only because of the Delphian, but the Delphian also lists her married name. She married Lucius Elder. So we can track her much more easily because we know who she married. We also know from a lot of records, school reports, newspaper articles would also list what the teachers were paid. Eliza actually remembers it wrong. In the Delphian, she says she was paid $5 a week. She was paid $7 a week. So she had it a little bit off. But that was pretty average. All the teachers are paid between $7 and $8 a week. And Mary Baker was the first teacher in the school, and she worked for 10 months and was paid $28 a month for 1862 to 63. And really the most that any of them ever got paid a month was $32 towards the end of the school's time. And the only ones who got paid more were principals or superintendents, and superintendents almost always were men. So they raked in the big bucks.
I think also it's important to point out that all the ward teachers were paid the same. So
Yes.
it wasn't a situation where the men were paid differently from the women. They were all paid the same, and a lot of it was based on the amount of time that they, as Regina said, as they taught.
Yeah.
Okay, this was the gold mine. 1863 to 1864 is the only list that we have of who was in the school, who was in the colored school. When you look through these catalogs, there is a lot of lists of what's going on in the union school. There's a lot of publicity about what's going on in the union school, and so there's a lot of lists of students at the union school, but not so much at the ward schools. But 1863-64, for some reason, they include the lists of all of the students of Kalamazoo Public Schools. So this was incredible. This was incredible to have. There are 79 names on this list. It breaks down to, probably, I would have to say, 40 boys and 39 girls. And so one of the biggest things we spent a lot of time doing was trying to find out information about these individuals. We hit a lot of brick walls as far as where we decided to look. We started with census reports. We looked at census records from 1850, 1860, 1870. We looked at city directories. We could look at anything that we could to try to find information about them. Just to give you at this point what we have, at this point, of the 79, so far we've only found about 53%. This is one of the things that we want to work on more. I'd love it if we could get to 100%. So age range of what we've been able to find from the individuals on that list, because what we did was, remember that list is 63, 64. The censuses we have are either 60 or 70. So we sort of gauged their ages at that time period when their names are on the list. So we have the age range of 4 through 21. We had one individual who was 20, one individual who was 21. Although you can see the majority were between the ages of 6 and 11. Places of the students' birth were interesting. A large number were born in Indiana. Specifically, there were 20 of those. 20 of the 42 that we found were born in Indiana. But you can see some other states in there, along with Canada. We had 2 of the students that were born in Canada. The parents' place of birth, the total number of parents that we found were 31. Keep in mind, when you looked at that list, there were a lot of siblings. We also ran into a situation with some of the families where the fathers were deceased, so we could only go on the information from the mother. But of the 31 total, you could see that 23 of them were born down south. North Carolina seemed to be the largest state, but also South Carolina, Georgia, Tennessee, Kentucky. But then we had some that were born in Ohio and New York, and we had some that were born in Canada. And we had several whose birthplace was unknown. As far as occupations go, this listing included day laborers, teamsters, seamstresses, washerwomen, and also washerwomen and ironers. Is what we have found. Some of them did not have occupations, and we also found farmers listed too, of the parents who were there. Again, one of our quests is to continue to try to find more information on the ones that we haven't been able to find yet. As Regina said, when it comes to the teachers' names, Some of the names on the list that we haven't found have harder names to try to find because of, we have a lot of Johns and a lot of things. So I don't want to say common names, but just prevalent names that are out there. So we're still searching. I don't know if you had anything to add or not on our list.
No, I mean, I agree with Lynn. We want to keep hunting and looking for these people and seeing if we can find them and find out more information on them.
This was an interesting thing, an interesting item that came to the archives in 2016. Never did I know when this notebook came in that it was going to have such value to this. And this is what's really interesting when you piece this information together and you piece the sources of where you get that information together. This is, I don't know if you'd call it a notebook or a small pocket notebook or whatever, but this belonged to a gentleman by the name of George Kennicott, who came to Gunplain Township in 1835 from New York, and he moved to Kalamazoo in 1853 for his children's education. He was a bookkeeper, a blacksmith, he was a superintendent of the gas works, and he was appointed the village marshal or village clerk at that time, and I also see his name on school inspector reports. What he did in 1865, specifically September of 1865, is he recorded all the students that were going to the Kalamazoo Public Schools at that time. From what I was able to tell by looking at this, he went door to door and copied names down in pencil. And this was another thing that we used a lot in finding out locations, because there were several of those names that had appeared in that 63-64 catalog that we found here in this book. So for example, we have right here, one of the names we have are the Dye family. Down here, we've got James, John, and Martha. And then up here we have the Scotts. This is Gentee Scott, Prince, Josephine, and Preston. Prince is not on the list, but the other three are. So how that helped us is in the other search we wanted to find, and that was, where did these people live? Because that all sort of goes along with this whole thing.
So this is the 1873 map again. The big red arrow is pointing at the school. And the smaller fuchsia arrows are pointing at some of these familiar names. Right next to the school is Augustus Hedgebeth, that's his property. Mrs. Bass lives diagonal from there. And then,
Do you want to point them out?
yeah, I probably should.
Yeah.
So, Augustus is here, Mrs. Bass is here. This is Thomas Hedgebeth. This is Mrs. Emily Dye. This is Mrs. Moore, and this is S. Moore. So all of these names are names connected to students at the colored school. The Hedgebeths on that 63-64 list was Lily, Mary J., Parthena, and Rosella. Mrs. Bass, and the Bass name is connected to Sarah and Mary. And the Dyes were Martha and John, like we saw on that list before. They're there again. And the Moores were David, John, Mary, and Rebecca. So we're finding them now in years later, living in this area, owning this property and these houses nearby the school.
So why did this become an obsession with us, to try to find out where these people were living? Well, the first thing was trying to find out, why was the school located where it was located?
So again, Eliza, she states in 1909 that the reasoning that she posits for the school being located where it was is that at the time, African American people in Kalamazoo were living north of Michigan Central Railroad and east of Burdick Street. When Lynn and I have looked through city directories, the early ones don't always list the roads, or they're a little bit vague on the road listings. But in 1860, the names that we can connect and know that they are African American citizens, they're living on Ransom east of Burdick, at the Burdick House on Main Street, on the Plank Road near Elm, on Water between Pitcher and Cherry, at the Tremont House on the corner of Main and Rose, the north side of Dutton between College and Park, and the corner of Kalamazoo Ave and Water.
So when I see something like this, and this is something that Regina and I talked about, okay, so you're reading this. So then there's some other things that we came upon. One of the things about the school catalogs is that they did, as I said, in the superintendent reports, they would give you all kinds of statistics, statistical tables. Every year they would give statistical tables, and they would give you the numbers of students at the various, like the Union School, and here we have the Ward schools, and here we have the colored school. And at this time, this is 1863-64, we've got 87 students that are registered in the school. Then they can do all these things, and I still haven't quite figured out what all of these columns mean. They talk about, average number on the register, average attendance. Then there's this thing right here, and that is number of tardiness per scholar. This becomes a really big thing for them. And here in 1863, 1864, they note that 5.20 is the number of tardiness per scholar. And they made a point of saying that.
And we found it, again, like Lynn said earlier, they listed with a lot of detail in the Gazette, in the newspaper, what the schools were reporting. So in 1862, so shortly after the school was started up, they're incredibly judgmental about all of the ward schools. The teachers were bad at teaching pronunciation, and the kids were too noisy, for one. And then this statement, that well, you can read it. It is incredibly judgmental and very haughty. And it intrigued us even more in thinking about this tardiness rate and the location of the school and where the families were actually living.
I also found in the school board minutes in March of 1865, the common schools are authorized to schedule a meeting of the Board of Education and the colored people of the district to find a way to secure better attendance at the colored school. The thing that always has stuck with me, and it's been something that I have tried to prove, is that maybe the reason for tardiness was not because of their lack of interest, but the reason for tardiness was because of where the school was located. And that not all of them, not all of the African Americans living in Kalamazoo at that time lived in that vicinity near the railroad and Burdick Street. And that's one thing that I'm trying so hard, and that's the other thing that we're trying to see, if we can find more of these students to disprove these statements that were made back then. So that's another thing on our list.
We've been able to do it a little bit. In an 1861 newspaper clipping, there's a small note about asking for approval for four black families who lived out of the district, asking for their students to attend the colored school. They lived east of the river, so we're on the left-hand side where the big pink arrow is, and it's pointing at Prairie on this right-hand side. So they were living out of district, which you can see the other red arrow on the opposite map is still pointing at where the school was located. Beyond that, when we've looked at the family listings, we know that multiple families lived on Seminary Road, which is present-day Riverview.
Yeah, around in this way, because this was the Michigan Female Seminary.
Yeah.
That when we looked at that first lithograph, and I showed you that building down in the corner, and so this is where the seminary is. So you have Gull Prairie Road, which is now Gull Road, but then you have what we know as Riverview, which sure seems like that was Seminary Road. Sharon Farrar was shaking her head. Yes,
Yeah.
I know I got that right. Okay.
And we know that the also Burnett, his family, he farmed and he lived out in Seminary Road. We know that multiple families lived on Seminary. So it's, again,
something to try to disprove this statement about this. Now, as far as high school goes, the high school opened up in 1859, and 4 years later, the first class graduated. I checked to see if there were any names from that 1863-64 listing. I didn't find anything, but that doesn't mean anything, because when you look at the statistics, there weren't that many students graduating from high school, period, at that point in time. In fact, I've said my grandfather, who was born in 1902, he got an 8th grade graduation in 8th grade, and that was it. He didn't go any further than that. Because when you look at the statistics, and yes, it was true that between that 8-year time period, I have at 0.4% of students graduated from high school. I mean, you might have a year where there might be 6 or 7, so I don't think that that says anything per se on that. So as far as high school goes, we had not found at this point right now any of the student listing that we had having graduated from high school, but I don't think that indicates anything at all. These were the numbers that appeared in all of the catalogs that covered the years that the colored school was opened in Kalamazoo. Whether or not these numbers really mean anything as far as, yes, maybe 101 were registered in 1869, 1870, but did that many actually attend? I don't know. I thought it was interesting that in 1869, 1870, the superintendent in his report suggested that night school be established to reach students not attending school now because they were working full-time. So they may have been registered, but they may have not been attending because of doing other things, earning money for their families.
Does that account for the drop in students the following years?
I don't know, Pam.
Yeah.
You know, I don't know.
Seems to be up and down.
You know.
Really doesn't.
Yeah, but this
Yeah.
is a 50% drop.
Yeah, I'm not sure.
Well, and if you think too about the years between, at 63 is when African Americans were able to sign up to serve.
Let's go back to that.
So there could be, I mean, so, 62, 63, and 64, 65, there's a pretty big difference. So that thought crossed my mind, that that could be part of it too. They would have potentially, hopefully, been too young, but they may have
We
lied.
had some of them at 21.
Exactly, so I that could have be part of it too. So these are in the collection at the Kalamazoo Valley Museum. They're examination record announcements for the Kalamazoo Public Schools. The left is 1867 and the right is 1870. And you can see at the top on both the bottom column, it shows the listed schedule for the colored school and the teacher, Ms. Bell on the left and Ms. Janish on the right. And it also lists all of the other schools, Union School, Intermediate and Grammar, and of course the high school is split up between specific subject.
Well, one of the things that we decided to do is to look at what was going on in other states, especially in the Midwest. And we only looked at 2 so far, Illinois and Ohio.
And Illinois, I took a look at some of what we were able to find writing about education in Illinois. Being from Illinois, I was a little sad to find that they did not, unlike Michigan, Indiana, and Ohio, it took them until 1870 to actually put anything about public education in their state constitution. So that was a bummer to find out that they lagged so far behind. And what I did find, which Lynn will talk a little bit about with Detroit, Chicago was unique from the rest of the state. Between June of 1863 and April of 1865, they actually had law-enforced segregation for schools. They basically decided all of a sudden that they were going to separate out the schools, and similar to Kalamazoo, all of the African-American children would attend one school. This was a huge issue because up until that point we had a large population that was all going to school together. They were with schoolmates that were the same age, they were in classrooms that were a little bit smaller, and they dumped them all into a one-room schoolhouse, basically. And similar to some of the reports that they were talking about tardiness, they were saying this, oh, the children aren't listening and they're being really unruly. Well, yeah, you dumped them all into this school with little bitties up to high school, and now they're expected to all go to school together. Many of them started just not going, and they went to the school they originally went to, and that is how it slowly fell apart. And then in 1865, the city charter stated that any children over the age of 6 could go to school, period.
In Ohio, I looked in the newspapers and I found mention of schools like what we had in Kalamazoo in a lot of different communities. There was no real pattern. Chillicothe, which is down in the South Ohio, Cincinnati, Toledo, Sandusky. Ohio even had a state law that had a state law on segregated schools, and that wasn't repealed until 1887. They had on the books. As far as Michigan goes, this is what was really helpful to have a website called Michigan County Histories, which is hosted by the University of Michigan. So we looked through those. We found colored schools in other communities in Michigan. You can see right there. Niles, Jackson, Ypsilanti, Pontiac, and Detroit. Still don't have the dates firmed up on how long they were there. Detroit, there is a lot of information about, and we'll get into Detroit a little bit better, but just briefly. Detroit established their first school for African Americans in 1839, although there's some publications that say 1840, 1841. The African Americans who were in Detroit were in, it was hard for them because a lot of them would be paying school taxes, and in the end what they did is they also funded their own schools, which were operated by churches in the Detroit area at that time period. There was tax support, and there was also then later a private school that was organized by William Lambert and J.J. Lightfoot. William Lambert was also involved with the Underground Railroad. There was a perception that the colored schools in Detroit that were maintained by the Board of Education were inferior, and there was mention when you read the early histories that the schools were far away from where the children lived, and some walked several miles to get to school. And by 1861, there were 2 to 3, again, depending on what source you read, 2 to 3 colored schools in Detroit that had a total of 185 students. So now we get to the question that has been hanging over our heads for a long time, and that is why. And I don't have the answer to that. There's certainly no explanation in the Kalamazoo Gazette as to why the Kalamazoo Public Schools decided to do this. But probably one of the best things that I've read about this came from an article about the Workman case, and we will get to that in just a little bit. And it's part of the Michigan Supreme Court Historical Society. And what they discuss about is the hierarchy of rights. And they said that free blacks in the North had a range of rights, but also a range of discrimination at this time. And they said, quite true, that in no state did they enjoy complete equality before the law. The way that this article discusses these is they define natural rights as the right of life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. They define civil rights as the right to enter into civil contracts like marriage, access to courts, inherit property. Political rights they define as the right to vote, the right to hold office, and the right to serve on juries or in the militia. These are just examples. And social rights would be the right to public accommodations, restaurants, theaters, hotels, railroads, employment, housing, and education. It was said in this article that by the time of the Civil War, African Americans in Michigan enjoyed, well, natural rights, civil rights, but not political or social rights. The best illustration of this that I can give you is in 1850, when the state of Michigan adopted its second constitution. And in that second constitution, when it came to suffrage, when it came to giving suffrage to African Americans, they were going to leave it up to the voters to decide on whether or not it should be given to, at that point, male African Americans, because female suffrage was not even talked about seriously at that time. When it came to the vote, there were 12,000 voters in Michigan that voted yes, and 32,000 that voted no. And that's the way that it remained until you have the passage of the various amendments, especially the 15th Amendment, that gave African Americans the right to vote. And I don't think that's, that doesn't answer our questions why, but I think it sort of puts some things into context that unfortunately, even though you're dealing with a state of Michigan that is deep, deep red, it adopted the Republican Party, was very much Republican, was very much involved with the Civil War and sending men to fight the Civil War. When it came to the issue of certain rights, they were not ones that wanted to give those rights, as hard as it is for me to say that. So then we get down to the state legislation and the Michigan Supreme Court. There are a couple things that happened that had an impact on what we were talking about tonight. In 1867, the state legislature of Michigan, that's 2 years after the end of the Civil War, passed what was called a general school law. The illustration I have here, that's the second Capitol in Lansing, which would have been the building that the legislature was in when they passed this law. The law said very simply, all residents of any district shall have an equal right to attend any school therein. Thus what that would do would be to end segregated education. The thing that happened, though, is the city of Detroit, not the city so much, but the school of Detroit fought it. The Detroit schools said that the law did not apply to them because the school system was established independently of any general school law. They also said things that, again, are very hard for me to say. The school claimed that racism by white residents would transfer to students, which would result in problems if schools were integrated. So it went back and forth. Finally, in 1869, the state attempted again. And what Michigan did was they adopted a school integration statute, which superseded the original school charter. Again, Detroit refused to comply. So those people who were against what was happening in education in Michigan turned to the courts. And that's where we get into the Workman case. Joseph Workman, in 1868, wanted his son, Cassius, to go to the 10th Ward School in the city of Detroit, where Mr. Workman lived and paid taxes. That school was closer to where they lived, as opposed to the colored school, which would have been a little more, which would have been further and harder for Cassius to get to. The Detroit schools refused. Joseph Workman maintained that the 1867 law applied to Detroit, and it resulted in a case called People ex rel, R-E-L, Joseph Workman v. the Board of Education of Detroit. Now Workman, which we don't have any illustrations of Joseph Workman, he received support from a number of people, including he received support from this gentleman here down in the lower level, whose name is John Bagley, who was from Detroit, later became governor of the state. He also received support from the Second Baptist Church, which helped fund this suit because it went right to the Supreme Court. It was also aided, too, by the support of this woman right here, Fanny Richards. Fanny Richards was born in Virginia, moved to Detroit in the 1850s. She studied in Canada. In 1863, opened a school for children of color. And in 1865, she taught at one of the colored schools in Detroit. So she was a big supporter of this case, and her brother John was also a politician in the area. So it went before the Supreme Court. This is basically just to sort of set, this is the Supreme Court of Michigan. I don't think it's a painting of the Supreme Court at this time during the Workman case. But what they did is the Workman had applied to the Supreme Court for the writ of mandamus. And the Michigan Supreme Court granted that writ in 1869 and said that the 1867 and 1869 laws were applicable to the city of Detroit. Judge Thomas Cooley also noted the lack of equal accommodations. Detroit continued to drag their feet. They did try to do some legal challenges, but in the end, they did comply. Now, I should say about Fanny Richards, she taught in the Detroit schools for over 50 years, and she is in the Michigan Women's Hall of Fame. So, how does that affect Kalamazoo? Austin George was the principal of the high school, and he was also superintendent. And in 1877, he wrote the first real narrative history of the Kalamazoo Public Schools, which was later copied in the 1880 county history, almost word for word. And he has this statement that the school closed in 1871, but he has this statement: when certain legal difficulties presenting themselves, I don't have any proof yet, haven't seen anything in the Kalamazoo Gazette, but the thing I'm wondering if the legal difficulties were the result of the Supreme Court case of Joseph Workman. Now, not all schools closed, unfortunately. I still want to confirm it, but there's still information out there that Ypsilanti kept their schools open a little bit longer. than Kalamazoo. It said that the colored school was broken up and the pupils distributed among the other schools. So 1871 is the date that we have. I have to say that reading the school board minutes, I thought 1871 there would be something in the school board minutes about this. No, no mention at all about the closure of it. So, go ahead.
Oh, you want me to go?
Yeah, okay.
So, like Lynn said, the school closed in 1871. The name ended up being changed to East School, and they still taught school there for another year. And then after that, students were transferred to Frank Street School, which is in the bottom right-hand corner. That's from a book at the museum. The building that the school was in was still owned by the district up until 1877, which is why it shows up in that 1873 map. The district still owned it, and it's still noted as being a school, even though at that point school wasn't being taught there.
So this is where they end the story for now. We still have, as you can tell, a lot of questions. Questions on my list are, I'd like to find, or not questions so much, but tasks. I'd like to find more students on that list. I would like to find the location for South and East Ward schools, but because I want to prove the point that the reason for the tardiness had nothing to do with their lack of interest. It had to do with other things. I'd like to do some more information, try to tighten up a little bit more about the schools, the other schools that existed in Michigan at the time, and I would love to find that first volume of the school board minutes. I don't know if that's going to happen. What's on your list, Regina?
Similar. I really want to find more on the students. We've been able to find, even from just that 1873 map, we know the families were in the area. So what else can we find out about them and their lives basically after this school? Of course, we would love to know the why and find that golden nugget line that says, well, we decided to do this because of that. But as we all know in history, that is generally not what you get. So,
Holy Grail.
yeah, no holy grail for us, I don't think. But yeah, just to continue finding out as much as we can.
So this has gone on for many months for us to do this. I think that we've been able to bring up information that has not been brought up before about this. It does, history, I always like to say, history is not all warm and fuzzy. Sometimes history is uncomfortable. And as uncomfortable as this history is, it does tell us, about a situation in Kalamazoo at this time. And I don't know exactly, like I said, I didn't have any conclusions at this point to come to it. But again, thank you for coming this evening. We're going to continue to plot on about this to see what else we can find. And if anybody, I don't know, I've never really had, like I said, I've never really had a program like this where it's just sort of ending like this. Anybody have any questions at this point? Yes?
What about Grand Rapids?
We could not find any in Grand Rapids. I talked to the local history librarians at the Grand Rapids Public Library. I looked at Z.Z. Leiden's book on the story of Grand Rapids and do not find anything there. We did do a little bit of searching, for example, in Schoolcraft. We looked at Mary Jane Schwartz's book, So I'm Told. And she talks about two young girls who escaped slavery with their mother and were with the Thomases, and they decided to stay in Schoolcraft with the Duncan family. And it is reported in there is that they went to school with the Duncans. So I know that you were looking at Cass County.
And found a little bit of mention of it, but nothing really concrete. So
I think that, why, again, you're thinking about when you're looking at the position of the other schools that we have in Michigan, it sort of follows loosely along the I-94 corridor. And does that have anything, because that is one of the routes on the Underground Railroad? I mean, I don't really know. Those are the other questions. But yes, I have looked into Grand Rapids.
That's a good point about Grand Rapids. It wasn't on the
yeah.
path.
It's much further north, and I'm not sure what their population of African Americans were at that time compared to what we were and what we had here in Kalamazoo. Sharon?
How about covert or greater kinship?
That's one thing to look into, but I don't expect to see any segregation there.
Right, exactly, but that's that counterpoint.
Well, and
Yeah.
that's why Regina was looking at Cass County, because you've got Cassopolis, Cass County, you got Vandalia. So, you know, I don't expect to see anything like that. Marty?
Talked with, there are a couple family names, Roberts, Wayne Roberts, or Gloria Lett, contemporary people with that last name who may have something, and who knows whether it's the same family, but have you talked with?
We talked with Donna Odom,
Sure.
with Cher, and some of the names that she recognized, and she had some information that she said that she could share with us. Regina has looked at trying to find these individuals as far as what happened to them afterwards, and she has found some interesting information about some of these individuals.
Yeah, there's the family that was listed up there, the last name is Duggett. Their daughter Alice ended up leaving the Kalamazoo area along with her mom, went down to Atlanta and became a teacher, and actually came back and spoke to Alice Pangeli's women's group. It's in the Gazette, and the McCandless and the Kersey families were living together, and I think I found them in Grand Rapids, but I can't prove it because they're spelling their names wrong. So I want to make sure I'm totally right and find them on a census where it lists their age, so I can prove that it's them and not just another last name. I've been able to find them.
We have found, again, going back to that list that we have with the students, we have found some of them remaining in Kalamazoo and having jobs at various locations. The city directories that we looked at closely, 60, 61, 67, 68, and then 69, 70, and found names of some of these individuals. So we have a list that we're working on as far as where we have found them. So we know, Donna is sure that we have individuals that went to school whose descendants still remain in Kalamazoo. And so like I said, this is not a complete story. The search is still going on. And I know it never is. It never is. I don't think you're done with influenza yet, are you, Sharon? Yeah.
Where are you going to look next?
I don't know. We had tonight as a date that we knew that we had to get some information done by that time period. After this, we need to regroup and see where we are going to go next. The thing with the census is, for those of you, and I know many of you have worked with the census before, so many times there's a difference between the way that the name was written and the way that the name was transcribed on the sheets of how people wrote it up. And so we know that with some of them, like even in the list of the students, the one student was listed as Lackery, and we found out no, his name was Zachary. So keep at the census to see what we can find.
Would there be anything from the state? The superintendent of instruction where is that at the state archives? Are there reports
They're in
there?
various places. I know we have some in the archives. I haven't even looked at those, and I think those are going to have more statistical information. They may have general. I don't know if they'll have any general information about these types of schools. I'm not sure. I think we had a
I've been holding
question.
my hand up here for a while.
Yes, and we're going to come over here too. That's
Yeah.
why I was coming over here.
You were mentioning Gloria Lett. Gloria Lett's family name is Smith,
Okay.
and they were primarily from Manistee, Michigan.
Okay.
Lett is her husband's name, and they primarily were from Battle Creek.
Yeah. So that may not assist us with the Lett family that we have on our list.
But it could be the same Letts.
Yeah.
I mean, it could be Ray Lett's family, because they were a lot closer in Battle Creek. But Gloria was, her family, they grew up in Manistee.
In Manistee.
But I did have a question too. You mentioned that the teachers, once they were married, they quit teaching. And I was wondering, was that a requirement that you had to be single to teach, or whether they just arbitrarily chose to raise a family and not work?
I don't know if it was a requirement. I'd have to go back and look at these catalogs to see if there's anything under rules or regulations, but I just have seen a pattern, shall we say?
Yeah,
A
there seemed to
pattern
be
more than a
pattern.
rule.
Yeah.
The first teacher for Kalamazoo, Eliza Coleman, She was only there for a very short time, and then she got married. She married a Seymour, and she was gone. So I think it may have been more of a pattern, more traditional than maybe a requirement for
Does that
that.
seem to be true in lots of other places?
Yes, and a lot of other professions too. I know this is like way far into that future compared to where we've been talking about, but like with the Upjohn Company during the Depression, I think that was something that was required. Yes, ma'am.
What about Lincoln? Lincoln School is that?
Lincoln School was built in 1924. Frank Street was literally around the corner from where Lincoln was built. And Frank Street continued to be used until Lincoln was built. And I think I want to say 1924, because you have one picture of that Frank Street school in the 20s, I think, early 20s before. So, and it was designed by Rockwell Leroy, who also did Chenery Auditorium. So I know it was in the early 20s. I'm going to say 24, Sharon. Does that sound correct? Okay.
I'm gonna think maybe 22.
22?
I think we have a dedication program.
Okay, so I was off a couple years.
I'm not positive.
But see, that's really interesting because it was around that time period that, and for those of you that have gone my walks have heard this way too many times, the Kalamazoo Public Schools were shifting the names of some of the schools to reflect the presidents. So Frank Street became Lincoln. And then you had Portage Street that became Washington. So there were several schools that changed their name. East became Roosevelt for that. So 1922. So 1922, Catherine?
That's what sticks in my mind. I'll try to remember to check tomorrow.
Okay. I know Catherine's always right. Yes?
Yeah, it's a disturbing history, but the question why colored schools is especially disturbing to me. Can we rely on the concept of white supremacy in general and racism in general as an explanatory force? I mean, it's been with us throughout American history. So this sort of throwing up our hands, it's almost why colored schools asking why have white people oppressed people of color?
And I think that's a good point. I just think that sometimes when you're younger and you're taught history years and years ago, many years ago. For me, it was many more years ago than you. You're taught a certain way, and I certainly have seen that when I was teaching Michigan history, like I mentioned the example of the Constitution of 1850. How, there was a big difference when you had people going to, fight the Civil War and what they were fighting for. Which is a little complicated than sometimes years ago when we were taught, they went to go fight the Civil War to end slavery. And it was more complicated than that, and it wasn't that primarily. So, again, this whole thing about trying to find a reason why, I certainly understand what you're saying, and you make a very good point. I was still trying to figure out, why.
Why did it go from
Why did it
integrated?
change? And yeah, why did it change? Why did it change from integration to segregation
Sure,
in '61?
but that's the same question as why did an integrated residential community become segregated? My point is white supremacy. How
Yeah.
did it prop up that? But it is still complicated.
Yeah, it is. Yes.
What would have been the length of a school year back then?
10 months is the longest that they show. 10 to 11 months
Oh, really?
is the longest they show a teacher being salary paid. So kind of like Lynn was saying, we don't know the separation between the different levels of schools. We also don't know what they considered a school year sometimes. But 10 months is kind of the longest that we've seen listed.
When Michigan first became a state, they required 3 months. But obviously, as the time went on, it became longer and longer as far as the duration of it. But the school inspector reports are interesting when they give that kind of information, when you see that. And what exactly, how much they got paid was revealed in a lot of different places, whether it be the school inspector reports or the Gazette or even the school board minutes. So we found out that information. Any other questions? Yes?
Well, I think in some of the rural areas, the agriculture aspect of people making a living sometimes adjusted the school year.
Yes, you're right. And in fact, one of the statements that's made about why Michigan would require school that they had to show at least a minimum of they had to hold it at least a minimum of 3 months or a minimum of 6 months, was because of the impact of agriculture on Michigan. Because of so many farm families that were there. Because again, 90% of the people in Michigan were involved with agriculture at this time period. Beth?
Before we wrap up, would you please mention about your series that's starting on March 19th?
Oh, okay. Because I had so much fun being mic'd up here, I'm going to be coming back in March. And for 15 years, I taught Michigan history at Western Michigan University. They have chosen not to have me come back. So instead, I've decided to share my knowledge and my information with everybody. And so I'm going to be doing 3 sessions, March, April, and May. And you said March 19th? March 19th at 7 o'clock. It is in the new newsletter that just came out for the Kalamazoo Public Library. So we'll be doing 3 sessions, March, April, and May, and then we'll probably pick it up again in the fall. And do that. What, Laura?
We get credit.
Do you get credit? You get credit for coming. I can't issue credit to you. And it's free. Yes.
Yes, I know that probably the first teachers were non-African American. So do you know who the first African American teacher was in Kalamazoo?
Pauline Johnson.
Well, and I know Pauline Johnson, you know, she graduated from Kalamazoo College.
I had her at Norris.
Yeah. I don't know if she was the first she was the first African American teacher. Yeah.
She was not the first African American. She graduated from K College.
And I know that has been said.
There were African Americans at the Western State Normal School in the teens. You look through the yearbooks and, you know, they're there.
I keep looking at Catherine because, like I said, Catherine knows everything. Okay, any other questions?
I just want to say one thing. Lynn understates her situation when she said Western Underground.
Oh, David, you don't have
That happened because they needed full-time professors teaching more students.
Yeah, it had nothing to do with my ability. Thank you, David. That's my husband. Because he certainly has heard enough about my sadness. But anyway, we move forward and we come here and spend evenings with, you know, lots of pleasant people. I want to thank Regina for joining this journey with me. I got her out of her comfort zone. I don't think she's used to this, and so we worked very, very hard to get to where we are up to this point. We've got to take a little breather and then go back to it again and see what we can find even more. Yes,
If
Pam?
anybody has thoughts or clues, who should we call? Anybody. I mean, if anybody.
Either of us. Either of us.
Either of you?
Yes, I mean, if you have thoughts, if you have clues, if you have suggestions on where we should go.
I'll go to the administration building with you.
And we'll look for that book on the
I
shelf.
don't know. I don't know.
Oh, that's a
I'll go, Lynn. You're gonna get
So who knows? Who knows?
All you can do is ask.
Well, that's true, Marty. All you can do is ask and see. And I've dropped some hints to people in Alex Lee's office, and you never know. You never know if it might come up and what that might bring us. Sometimes when you think you're finding the golden fleece, it doesn't turn out to be so golden, and it doesn't give you exactly what's there. But thank you for coming this evening. I know I speak for Regina. It's sort of exciting, especially when you find something like this. And again, let me put in the plug. If you've never been to the archives, please come and see us. We're open Tuesday through Saturday. We'd love to have you come, and if not, we'll give you a tour. Or if you haven't been in there, we'll make sure that we give you a tour. A lot of history is hidden, but I hope by tonight we've sort of unearthed and introduced some of the hidden history of Kalamazoo to you so that it doesn't remain hidden anymore. So thank you for coming this evening. Have a pleasant night, and we hope to see you again.